Hello, my name is Zachary O'Hagan from the University of California, Berkeley, and today my poster on voice alternations in Caquinte will take the form of a few slides. Before I begin, I acknowledge with respect the Ohlone people on whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded land I live and work, and whose historical relationships with that land continue to this day. Here is a photograph of my field site at Quitepampani in the Cusco region of Peru. Caquinte is a Nihagansi, Arawak language of the Junin and Cusco regions. It is a vital language with several hundred speakers across some 6 communities, although it is more recently threatened by the related languages Ashaninka and Matsigenga. It is a VSO language that is strongly headmarking and largely agglutinative, resulting in fairly long words as in one, Irishekataka hiya pohembarini, so that they could make him eat it. Reality status, as argued by Lev Michael in a 2014 article on related Nanti, is the marking of a distinction between realized and unrealized events, which we can appreciate with the Caquinte examples in 2 through 4. Nanihiti, I'm walking, with a realis suffix I. Nanihite, I'll walk, interpreted as a future and with the irrealis suffix a. And te nanihitehi, I didn't walk, a negative statement which also has irrealis marking because negated past events are unrealized in a way similar to future events. Voice, in contrast, is a relation between argument structure and thematic roles. The familiar active versus passive distinction is a voice distinction. And I note that unlike some other Nihagansi languages, such as Matsigenga, Caquinte lacks a passive construction. Homing in on middle voice, it's received a variety of characterizations. One characterization is formal, namely by which middle voice is an inflectional category alternating with active and possibly a passive in some languages. Its semantic characterization has been said to include an agentive subject that is affected by an event, as opposed to the relatively unaffected subjects of events marked as active. Suzanne Kemmer, in a 1993 book, invokes the notion of the relative elaboration of events to predict the distribution of middle marking in the world's languages. The relative elaboration of an event is the degree to which the participants and component sub-events in a particular verbal event are distinguished. I won't dwell on this notion too much, but I would give an example, one of her examples, namely that a reciprocal is a case of the lower degree of elaboration of events as opposed to a non-reciprocal verb. Caquinte reality status and voice are inflectional categories expressed in part cumulatively, which can be appreciated by the affixes summarized in table 1. So when the verb is both active and realis, the suffix is e, but when it is middle and realis, the suffix is a. When the verb is irrealis, there's a common suffix shared in a, and when it is active in the irrealis, there is no additional marking, but when it is middle in the irrealis, there is the additional marker ba, which you will see glossed as just mid for middle, whereas a is glossed as IRR for irrealis. In some work, the sequence emba has been analyzed as a single suffix, but in Caquinte, these 2 suffixes are separated symplectically by the recipient applicative NV. Now turning to the productive voice alternations in Caquinte, many verbs exhibit an alternation whereby its intransitive form is middle, but its transitive form is active. And this can be appreciated by comparing 5 and 6. Asateka, it gets stuck in between with middle marking, versus nasatekiro, I stick it in between with active marking. Other verbs, unlike asatek, this root, occur only with middle marking or only with active voice marking, meaning they do not show the productive alternation we see here. A more elaborate set of alternations can be appreciated by examining the verb kitsa, dress. So in 7 and 8, we have similar intransitive and transitive pairs. O kitsata, she dresses herself with middle marking, middle realis marking, and 8, o kitsatiri, she dresses him. Now a transitive verb with an object suffix ri and active marking. 9 and 10 are simply the irrealis counterparts of 7 and 8. Ongitsa temba, she will dress herself, and ongitsa teri, she will dress him. In 9, we see middle marking, both the irrealis a and the middle mpa, And in 10, when the verb becomes active, the middle mba goes away, and all we have is the irialis a, in addition to, in this case, to the object suffix. In the SIL descriptive tradition, the a and mba suffixes have been described as reflexives. We can appreciate that these are not reflexive strictly speaking, because the verb in Caquinte is not made intransitive by middle marking. So in 11, we have the active, okitsati di itsare. She puts his clothes on him. Verses 12, the middle marked, okitsataro oitsare. She puts her clothes on, namely on herself. The verb is middle as we see, but an object suffix is still present, as is the full object noun. These distinctions lead to the categorization of verbs by their voice properties. So far we've seen examples of alternations where the intransitive form is middle and the transitive form is either rigidly active, as with asatek, or active or middle, as with dress, depending on what the interpretation is to be. And as I mentioned previously, some verbs are either rigidly active, as with katsima, or middle, rigidly middle, as with sheka, to eat. In what follows now, I want to turn to briefly describing 4 special conditions on voice in which the actual attested voice marking is not what we would expect based on the productive alternations we have seen. So the first special condition is with certain verbal suffixes. Certain verbal suffixes are expected semantically to invoke middle marking. So in the case of the reciprocal, which was in Kemmer's list of likely middle marked verbs, we see that the typically active verb, katsima, when marked with the reciprocal, becomes middle. So in this clause, angatsimata waka kembayeti, when we are upset with each other. In contrast, other verbal suffixes like itse, which does not have a semantics that would predict middle marking, happen to force middle marking nevertheless. So the verb root ohokihi is typically active, but in the presence of itse, it is middle, yohokihit taro isarihi, and he placed it on the ground. The second condition is with certain kinds of objects. So there are no restrictions on voice with third person objects, as in ishekataro, he eats it in 15. But when objects are first or second persons, that is speech act participant objects, middle marking is required. So unlike the normally middle verb eat, sheka, when ishekatimbi is active because the object is second person. The third special condition has to do with irialis contexts with some verbs. So in these cases, some inherently middle verbs like run, or verbs that are middle in the realis, no shianaka, I ran away, become irialis, certain verbs that are middle in the realis become active in the irialis. So here we can contrast no shianaka with no shianake in the irialis, and oppose it to no shianakemba, which would be the expected irialis form if the verb remained middle. In contrast, no verb is ever active in the realis, but middle in the irialis. That is the opposite kind of alternation is not attested in Caquinte. Finally, the last special condition is on the extraction of an S argument. By extraction, I mean focus, relativization, or questioning of an S argument. In these cases, voice marking becomes obligatorily active. So again, with the middle verb sheka, eat, ishekaka, he ate, in the unextracted context, when we focus the subject, idio shekatangits, it was him who ate. Instead of getting the middle marking of 19, we get the active marking seen in 20. To summarize and conclude, Caquinte voice is an inflectional category intertwined with reality status. It is expressed cumulatively in the realis, but with distinct morphemes in the irialis. The notion of event elaboration explains some, but not all middle voice marking. Namely, there are productive alternations alongside lexical specification and morphosyntactic idiosyncrasies, such as the extraction of S arguments. Related languages such as Matsigenga preserve voice distinctions collapsed in some contexts in Caquinte. So whereas we had Ankitsi in 20, Matsigenga would have Ankicha, preserving the middle voice. Related languages with passives exhibit a similar distribution, namely where there are 2 realis forms of the passive and 1 irrealis form. That is a similar distribution to the voice marking we've seen in Caquinte. This is an important area for future work. And finally, the category of voice has not been recognized previously due to the lack of focus on the middle transitive verbs, like we saw with eat and dress, and or due to the low productivity of these alternations in some languages, such as Nanti. Thank you.